I was 28 when I stood in the bridal suite with a safety pin between my teeth and a bouquet heavy in my hands, watching my best friend turn slowly in front of the mirror like she was trying to convince herself she belonged in all that white. The room smelled like hairspray and warm curling irons. Someone had spilled champagne on the carpet earlier, and the sweetness hung in the air under the sharp bite of perfume. Outside the window, the city looked washed clean by an early summer rain. Streets shining, traffic moving like a soft ribbon, people hurrying under umbrellas as if nothing important was happening at all. But something important was happening. And I was paying for it. Not just the venue. Not just the dress. Not just the flowers and the photographer and the little gold foil invitations she'd picked out while biting her lip like she was choosing a future. I was paying with the kind of loyalty you don't realize is expensive until it's gone. My name is Eleanor Finch, and I'm 72 now. I'm sitting at my kitchen table as I tell you this, mug of tea cooling beside my hand, the radiator clicking on and off like an old man clearing his throat. The world is quieter at this age. Not empty. Just honest. Sounds don't hide behind excitement anymore. Silence doesn't pretend to be peace. And I've learned something, sitting with my own memories for this long. Sometimes the biggest betrayals don't arrive like a storm. They arrive like a smile. Before I go any further, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from today? And have you ever loved someone so much you excused things you shouldn't have? If you've ever been that person, just tap the like button so I know I'm not alone in this. And if stories like mine mean something to you, if you've ever carried a truth in your chest for years, subscribe. I don't tell these things to be dramatic. I tell them because silence nearly swallowed me whole. Back then, in 1981, I wasn't Eleanor Finch the widow with soft grey hair and hands that shake a little when the weather turns. I was just Ellie with the bright laugh, Ellie who believed friendship was forever if you watered it, Ellie who still thought love worked like the movies if you tried hard enough. My husband, Daniel, was downstairs in the hotel lobby that morning, adjusting his tie and charming my mother the way he always did. He had this calm confidence, like he was born knowing where his hands belonged and what to say to make a room soften toward him. He'd been a schoolteacher when I met him, history of all things, and his voice had that gentle patience that made you feel safe, like nothing in life could get too out of control if he was standing beside you. We'd been married 6 years by then. No children yet. 2 miscarriages that sat quietly between us like an unspoken prayer. But we loved each other in a steady way. We had a small brick house in Richmond, Virginia. Nothing fancy, but clean and warm. A porch swing Daniel had hung himself. A kitchen where the cabinets always smelled faintly of onions and lemon soap. Sunday mornings with jazz on the radio and pancakes that were never quite round. And then there was Harper Lane. Harper had been my best friend since college. She was the kind of woman people noticed without knowing why. Long dark hair, eyes like polished stones, lips that always looked like they were about to tell a secret. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't evil. That's the part people don't understand when I tell them this story. She was just hungry. Hungry for love. Hungry for certainty. Hungry for a life that didn't slip through her fingers the way her childhood had. Harper grew up with a mother who drank too much and a father who disappeared when she was 9. She learned early that nothing was promised. She learned to keep her chin high even when the ground under her feet was crumbling. And when we were young, I admired her for it. I thought her toughness was strength. I didn't realize it was also a kind of loneliness. When Harper got engaged to Mason Brooks, a soft-spoken accountant with kind eyes and a nervous laugh, she cried in my arms like she'd been holding her breath for years. "I can't mess this up, Ellie," she whispered into my shoulder one night, mascara wet on my blouse. "I can't go back to being nothing. You're not nothing, I told her, stroking her hair the way you would a child. You never were. And I meant it. The wedding was her dream, but Mason didn't come from money. Harper didn't either. My husband and I weren't wealthy, but Daniel had recently inherited a modest amount from his aunt, enough to pay off our car and tuck something away. We'd been careful with it. Responsible. But then Harper sat at my dining table with a stack of magazines and that look in her eyes. The one that said, "Please don't let me down." "I don't want a big wedding," she lied gently. "Just something beautiful. Something that looks like it matters." And I looked across the table at Daniel, expecting him to shake his head. Instead, he reached for my hand. "If it matters to her," he said quietly, "it matters." That should have been my first clue, you know. Not that he wanted to help. Daniel was generous. Always had been. But the way he didn't look at me when he said it. The way his thumb pressed into my palm, a little too firm, like he was reminding me who he was. Or maybe, reminding himself. So yes, we paid. We wrote checks with smiles on our faces. We toured venues with Harper squealing and clapping her hands. We listened to her argue about peonies versus roses. We watched her try on dresses and say, "No, no, this one makes me look ordinary," as if ordinary was a death sentence. And through it all, Daniel was there. Too often, if I'm being honest. Harper would call in the evening to ask about seating charts, and Daniel would take the phone from me. "Oh, Harper," he'd say, leaning against the kitchen counter, smiling like he was amused by her. "You're going to give yourself gray hair before 30. And Harper would laugh, this low, delighted sound that always made my stomach tighten for reasons I couldn't name. Sometimes I'd walk into the living room and find him helping her with something. Moving a table, fixing a loose hinge at her apartment, carrying boxes. He'd come home smelling like her perfume, light and floral, clinging to his shirt. "Harper needed help," he'd say, like that explained everything. And I would nod. Because she was my best friend. Because he was my husband. Because I trusted them both so much I didn't even realize I was handing them privacy like a gift. The day of the wedding, Harper looked radiant. The kind of radiant that makes you forgive people their flaws because you think, maybe they've suffered enough to deserve this moment. She took my hands in the bridal suite, her fingers cold despite the heat. "You did this," she whispered. "You made this possible. You're my family," I said. "Of course I did." Her eyes shimmered, and for a second, she looked like the Harper I met in a dorm hallway. Barefoot, laughing, holding a cup of instant noodles, asking if I wanted to watch a movie with her because she didn't want to be alone. Then there was a knock. One of the bridesmaids poked her head in. "Ellie, your husband is asking for you downstairs." I remember smoothing my dress, taking one last look at Harper, and thinking, how lucky we are. How good life can be. I didn't know that, even then, Harper had already been standing beside my husband in private. I didn't know that the wedding I paid for was the first beautiful lie they would share. And I certainly didn't know that within a year, I would be sitting on my own bedroom floor, holding a crumpled receipt in my shaking hands, wondering how a friend can steal a life without leaving fingerprints. The year after Harper's wedding passed the way years often do when you're busy pretending everything is fine. Life resumed its ordinary rhythms. Daniel went back to his classroom each morning with his worn leather briefcase and his tie slightly crooked by lunchtime. I returned to my job at the public library, shelving books, helping children find the right stories, breathing in that familiar scent of paper and dust that always made me feel grounded. Harper and Mason moved into a small townhouse on the edge of the city, close enough for dinner visits, far enough to feel like they were starting something new. On the surface, nothing had changed. But beneath it, there were small disturbances, like ripples in water after someone has thrown a stone and walked away. Harper began calling Daniel more than she called me. At first, I told myself it made sense. He'd helped with the wedding finances. Mason worked late hours during tax season. Daniel was good at listening. Too good sometimes. He had that patient teacher's voice that made people feel understood. "She just needs advice," he'd say when I raised an eyebrow. "Marriage is an adjustment." "I'm her best friend," I reminded him once, trying to keep my tone light. "And you're incredible at that," he said, kissing my forehead. "But sometimes people talk differently to someone outside it." Outside it. I didn't know why that phrase stayed with me. I just knew it did. Harper started stopping by our house unannounced. She'd let herself in like she always had, calling out my name, kicking off her shoes by the door. Sometimes I'd be home, and we'd drink tea at the kitchen table, talking about Mason's long hours or her worries about becoming invisible now that she was a wife. Other times, I wouldn't be home yet. I'd walk in to find Daniel and Harper sitting on the couch, heads bent together, voices low. They'd jump apart slightly when I entered, smiling too quickly. "Ellie," Harper would say brightly, standing up. "I didn't know when you'd be back." Daniel would clear his throat, turn off the radio, pick up his book. Nothing inappropriate. Nothing obvious. Just enough to make me feel like I'd interrupted something I wasn't meant to see. The first time I really noticed it, I was standing in the hallway, listening. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop. I was just hanging up my coat, still in my work shoes, when I heard Harper's voice from the living room. "I don't feel like myself anymore," she said softly. "I thought marriage would make me feel chosen." Daniel didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "Sometimes people choose the wrong moments," he said. "That doesn't mean they chose the wrong person." I stood there longer than I should have, my hand resting on the wall, my breath shallow. Something in his tone, gentle, intimate, made my chest tighten. I walked in a moment later, forcing a smile. "Am I interrupting?" I asked. They both looked up, startled. "No," Harper said too quickly. "We were just talking." "About life," Daniel added. "About life." That became their phrase. I started noticing how Harper watched him. The way her eyes followed his movements around the room. The way she laughed a beat too late at his jokes, like she was savoring them. The way Daniel seemed to straighten when she entered, smoothing his shirt, adjusting his glasses. I told myself I was imagining it. After all, Harper was married. And Daniel loved me. Didn't he? One evening, a few months later, I came home to find Daniel in the kitchen, unusually quiet. Dinner was half prepared, onions chopped but not cooking, the stove cold. "Everything okay?" I asked. He nodded, rubbing his face with his hands. "Just tired." The phone rang. Daniel looked at it, hesitated, then picked it up. "Hello." There was a pause. I watched his shoulders shift, his posture soften. "Harper," he said. I turned away, pretending to wash my hands, but I listened anyway. Yes, I understand. No, I don't think you're wrong." Another pause. "You shouldn't have to feel that way," he said gently. "You deserve to feel seen." The word seen echoed in my head like a dropped plate. When he hung up, I turned to him. "She sounds upset," I said. "She's struggling," he replied. "Marriage isn't what she thought it would be." "And Mason?" I asked. He shrugged. "He's not very present." I wanted to ask him why he knew that. I wanted to ask why Harper felt comfortable calling my husband when she felt unseen by her own. Instead, I set the table. There's a strange kind of self-betrayal that happens when you sense something is wrong but choose peace over truth. You start editing your own thoughts, softening your instincts, convincing yourself that suspicion is uglier than betrayal. I didn't want to be that woman. The jealous friend. The suspicious wife. So I swallowed it. Then came the dinner. We invited Harper and Mason over one Sunday night in early autumn. The leaves were just beginning to turn, the air sharp and clean. I cooked pot roast, the kind that fills the house with warmth and patience. We sat around the table, passing dishes, talking about work, about the weather, about nothing at all. Mason was distracted, checking his watch, nodding at the wrong moments. Harper barely looked at him. Instead, she looked at Daniel. At one point, Daniel reached for the breadbasket at the same time Harper did. Their fingers brushed. It was nothing. A fraction of a second. But the way they froze. The way they looked at each other. The way Harper's breath caught. Just slightly. I felt something settle in my stomach. Heavy and cold. That night after they left, I stood in the doorway of my bedroom and watched Daniel take off his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Are you happy?" I asked him. He looked at me, surprised. "Of course. You seem distracted lately." He sighed, coming over to me, placing his hands on my shoulders. "Ellie, you worry too much. Everything's fine." I nodded, because I wanted it to be true. But something had shifted. I could feel it in the way silence stretched between us. In the way Harper's name landed in the room like a presence even when she wasn't there. I didn't know it yet, but the first real clue, the undeniable one, was already on its way to me. And when it arrived, it would come in the form of something small. Ordinary. Almost easy to ignore. The thing about real clues is that they don't announce themselves. They arrive folded into everyday life, tucked inside routines you trust. They look like clutter. Like coincidence. Like something you tell yourself you'll ask about later. Later came for me on a Wednesday afternoon. I had taken the day off work because my feet were aching in a way that felt deeper than sore muscles. The kind of ache that comes from standing still too long in life. I remember thinking I'd spend the day cleaning. One of those quiet, domestic resets that makes you feel useful even when nothing else does. Daniel had left early for school. He kissed my cheek, grabbed his briefcase, and reminded me there was leftover soup in the fridge. Ordinary. Kind. Familiar. I was halfway through sorting laundry when I realized his briefcase was still by the door. That in itself meant nothing. He forgot things sometimes. His lunch, his papers, once even his car keys. I picked it up to move it out of the way and felt how heavy it was. Too heavy. I don't know why I opened it. Curiosity, maybe. Or that soft, nagging pressure that had been building in my chest for months, asking to be acknowledged. Inside were his lesson plans, a stack of essays, his glasses case, and an envelope. Cream-colored. Thick. Addressed in Harper's handwriting. My name wasn't on it. His was. I stood there longer than I should have, the envelope resting in my palm like it was warm. My first instinct was to put it back. To tell myself it was none of my business. That privacy mattered. That trust mattered more. But trust, I was learning, can be a one-sided contract. I slid the envelope open. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a receipt. The receipt caught my eye first. Dinner at a small Italian place near Harper's townhouse. A date from the week before. A time Daniel had told me he was grading papers late. My hands started to tremble then. Not violently. Just enough that the paper rustled when I unfolded it. Ellie. I don't know how to say this out loud, so I'm writing it instead. I keep trying to be what I'm supposed to be, but every time I'm with you, I feel like I can breathe again. Please don't pull away. I don't think I can handle that. H. There were no hearts. No declarations. No explicit confession. Just enough truth to make my knees weaken. I sat down on the edge of the couch, the letter limp in my hand. The house felt suddenly unfamiliar, like I was a guest in someone else's life. The ticking clock grew louder. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a lawnmower droned on, indifferent to the fact that my world had just tilted. I read the note again. And again. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe I was misunderstanding. Maybe Harper was confiding in Daniel the way she always had, dramatically, emotionally, leaning on him the way some people lean on furniture without thinking about who built it. But the receipt. The word you. The way my name wasn't there at all. I folded everything carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Then I did something I'm not proud of. I waited. I didn't confront him that night. Or the next day. Or even the day after that. I watched. I started noticing patterns. Daniel's phone angled away from me when he texted. The way he stepped outside to take calls. How Harper suddenly stopped calling me altogether. When I called her, she sounded distracted. Guilty, maybe. How are you? I asked one afternoon. Fine, she said quickly. Busy. With what? I asked. There was a pause. Life. Life again. One evening, Daniel came home late, smelling faintly of garlic and wine. Long meeting? I asked, my voice steady in a way that surprised me. Yes, he said. Department stuff. I nodded. You should take a shower. Dinner's in the oven. As he walked past me, I noticed something on his shirt. A faint smear of lipstick near the collar. Not my shade. Not my texture. Harper always wore hers matte. A deep rose color she said made her feel powerful. I didn't say anything. That night, I lay awake listening to his breathing, slow and even beside me. I wondered how long someone could sleep next to you while standing somewhere else with their heart. The next confirmation came from Mason. He called me on a Saturday morning, his voice tight, controlled. Ellie, he said. Can we talk? We met at a coffee shop downtown. He looked thinner than I remembered, his eyes tired. I don't want to accuse anyone, he said, staring into his cup. But Harper's been distant, secretive. My chest tightened. What do you mean? She says she's with you, he said quietly. But you don't answer when I call. I didn't correct him right away. She's been spending a lot of time with Daniel, he added. Hasn't she? That was the moment denial stopped being an option. I went home and stood in my kitchen, staring at the phone on the wall. The cord felt heavy when I lifted it, like it knew what I was about to do. I dialed Harper's number. She answered on the third ring. Ellie, she said softly. Harper, I replied. We need to talk. There was a long silence on the line. Long enough to tell me everything. I know, she whispered. And just like that, the truth stepped fully into the room. I drove to Harper's townhouse that evening with both hands tight on the steering wheel, my shoulders locked like I was bracing for impact. The sky was already dark, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. Her porch light was on. She'd been expecting me. She opened the door before I could knock. Her face was pale, bare. No lipstick. No performance. Come in, she said quietly. The living room looked the same as always. Neutral furniture, carefully chosen throw pillows, a framed wedding photo still hanging on the wall. Harper and Mason, frozen mid-laugh, like proof of something that no longer existed. We stood there for a moment, neither of us moving. How long? I asked. She swallowed. Ellie. How long? I repeated, my voice calm in a way that felt unreal. Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Since before the wedding. The words landed softly. That was somehow worse. Before the wedding. Before the vows I helped her write. Before I zipped her into that white dress with shaking hands. Before I paid deposits and smiled for photographs. So while I was standing beside you, I said slowly, you were already standing beside my husband. She nodded. Once. I never meant for it to. I raised my hand. Not in anger. In finality. Don't, I said. Don't explain it like a mistake. You made choices. Both of you did. She sank onto the couch, pressing her palms into her eyes. I didn't plan to fall in love with him. I laughed then. A short, hollow sound that surprised us both. You didn't plan to stop it either, I said. She looked up at me, desperation flickering across her face. He understands me, Ellie. He sees me in a way. That's my husband, I said. Or he was. The word was still strange in my mouth. Was. I didn't stay long. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't turn me into someone I didn't want to be. I walked out of her house with my head held high, even though my legs felt weak. Daniel was home when I returned. Sitting at the kitchen table. Waiting. I was going to tell you, he said before I could speak. I set my purse down carefully. Took off my coat. When? I asked. He hesitated. Soon. After the wedding? I asked. After the money was spent? After the lies stacked up so high you couldn't see over them? He rubbed his hands together, a nervous habit I hadn't seen in years. I never meant to hurt you. You succeeded anyway, I said. He tried to explain it like a slow drift. Like something that happened to him instead of something he participated in. Emotional closeness. Shared conversations. One line crossed after another. She needed me, he said. So did I replied. That was the moment something in me hardened, not with rage, but with clarity. I want the truth, I said. All of it. And to his credit, he gave it to me. How long they'd been meeting. Where. The lies they coordinated. The way Harper would cry and say she felt trapped, and how that made him feel important. Necessary. I listened. Quietly. Filing every detail away like evidence. I'm leaving, he said finally. I think I love her. I nodded. Then you should go. He looked surprised. Maybe he expected me to beg, to scream, to fall apart. Instead, I stood up and opened the drawer where we kept important papers. You're not taking the house, I said. Or the savings. That inheritance paid for her wedding. I have receipts. His face drained of color. You paid for her future, I continued, my voice steady. You don't get to build yours on what's left of mine. He left that night with a suitcase and a look on his face I'll never forget. Not guilt, exactly. More like shock that there were consequences. The fallout came quickly. Mason filed for divorce within weeks. Word spread the way it always does. Quietly at first, then all at once. People chose sides. Some avoided me out of discomfort. Others came bearing casseroles and soft apologies. Harper tried to call me once. I didn't answer. Daniel moved in with her. It didn't last. Turns out love that grows in secrecy doesn't always survive daylight. I rebuilt my life slowly, painfully, with boundaries instead of blind loyalty. I learned that dignity isn't loud, and revenge doesn't have to be cruel to be complete. Years later, when I pass that old wedding photo in my memory, I don't feel anger anymore. I feel relief. Because I lost a friend and a husband that day, but I kept myself. And at my age, that matters more than anything. The months that followed felt like learning how to walk again after a long illness. Everything was familiar, but nothing felt the same. Daniel's absence settled into the house in small, unexpected ways. His mug still sat in the cabinet, the one with a thin crack along the handle. His shoes were gone from the closet, but the indent they'd left on the carpet remained. At night, the other side of the bed stayed cold, and I learned how loud silence can be when it has space to echo. People asked how I was doing in cautious voices, as if grief might break if they spoke too loudly. I told them I was managing, which was true in a way. Managing doesn't mean healing. It just means continuing. I kept my routines. I went to work. I watered the plants. I paid the bills and folded laundry and made soup for one. Ordinary things, done with extraordinary effort. Mason came by one afternoon to return a box of things Harper had left at our house over the years. Old books. A scarf. A framed photo of the two of us from our 20s, arms slung around each other, laughing at something I can't remember now. "I'm sorry," he said, standing awkwardly in my doorway. "For everything." "I know," I replied. And I meant it. He had been collateral damage in a war he didn't start. He hesitated before leaving. "For what it's worth, she's not happy." I nodded. I wasn't surprised. Daniel and Harper tried to make a life together. I heard bits and pieces through the quiet network of acquaintances and well-meaning friends who couldn't help passing information along. They argued about money, about trust, about the same things they'd bonded over in secret, now exposed, stripped of romance. I never confronted either of them again. There was nothing left to say that would change the shape of what had already happened. Instead, I focused on rebuilding something small and solid for myself. I repainted the bedroom a soft, warm cream. I donated clothes that no longer felt like mine. I took long walks through my neighborhood, noticing details I'd ignored before. The way one house always smelled of bread in the afternoons, the elderly man who fed birds every morning at the same time. There's a quiet power in choosing yourself after being chosen last. One evening, months later, I sat at my kitchen table balancing my checkbook. The numbers told a story I already knew. The money we'd spent on Harper's wedding had changed my future in ways I couldn't undo. There would be no extravagant trips, no early retirement. But there would be stability and peace. I met with a lawyer, not out of bitterness, but clarity. Daniel tried, briefly, to negotiate, to soften the terms, to appeal to memories. "I never meant to hurt you," he said again, over the phone. "I know," I replied. "But intent doesn't erase impact." We finalized the separation quietly. No courtroom drama. No public spectacle. Just paperwork and signatures and a door closing without a slam. The first time I laughed again, really laughed, caught me by surprise. It happened at work, of all places. A child asked me for help finding a book about dragons but not scary ones. And something about the earnestness of it cracked through my heaviness. I realized then that joy doesn't ask permission to return. It just waits until there's room. Years passed. I grew older. Softer in some ways, stronger in others. My hair grayed. My hands learned the language of age. I made new friends, carefully this time. I learned to ask questions, to trust but verify, to love without disappearing. Once, long after everything had settled, I ran into Harper at the grocery store. She looked different. Not worse. Just worn. Life had etched itself onto her face the way it does to all of us eventually. We stood there, two women who shared too much history to pretend we were strangers. "I think about you often," she said quietly. "I don't," I replied, not unkindly, just honestly. She nodded. "I understand." As I walked away, pushing my cart down the aisle, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not forgiveness. Not anger. Closure. I had spent years believing loyalty meant staying, no matter the cost. I learned instead that loyalty to yourself is the only kind that doesn't eventually ask for repayment. Now, at 72, when I sit at this same kitchen table and tell you this story, I don't feel the sharp edge of betrayal anymore. I feel the weight of wisdom earned the hard way. If you're still listening, if you've ever put someone else's happiness ahead of your own until you disappeared, tell me this: what finally made you choose yourself? These days, my mornings begin slowly. I wake before the sun, not because I have to, but because my body has learned its own rhythm. The house creaks as it always has, familiar and patient. I make tea the same way every morning. Loose leaves, not bags, steeped just long enough to smell like warmth. I sit at this same kitchen table, the one that has held my joy and my grief, my celebrations and my reckonings. Time has softened the sharpest edges of what happened, but it hasn't erased the truth of it. And I wouldn't want it to. There's a strange peace that comes when you stop wishing your life had turned out differently and start understanding why it turned out exactly the way it did. For a long time after Daniel left, I wondered if I should have seen it sooner. If I'd been stronger, smarter, less generous. I replayed moments in my head like scenes from an old film, the way Harper laughed a little too hard at his jokes, the way Daniel leaned toward her without realizing it, the way I smiled through discomfort because I believed kindness would protect me. But age has taught me this. Hindsight is not wisdom. It's just memory with better lighting. The truth is, I loved honestly. I trusted fully. I showed up for people I believed in. And that was never my failure. I see now that Harper didn't take my husband because she was evil. She took him because she was empty and didn't know how to fill herself without borrowing from someone else's life. Daniel didn't leave because I was lacking. He left because being needed felt easier than being accountable. Understanding that didn't come overnight. It came in quiet moments, watching dust float in afternoon light, folding laundry alone, hearing my own voice in a room without interruption. It came the first time I said no without explaining. The first time I chose rest over obligation. The first time I realized I didn't need to be indispensable to be worthy. There were other loves after Daniel. Not marriages. Not grand romances. But companionships that were gentle, honest, brief. People who met me where I was instead of asking me to disappear into who they needed. And that was enough. Sometimes younger women ask me how I survived betrayal like that, from a friend and a husband at the same time. They expect advice that sounds like strength, like resilience, like triumph. But the real answer is quieter. I survived because I stopped arguing with reality. I stopped waiting for apologies that wouldn't heal me. I stopped hoping people would become who I needed them to be. I accepted what was, and then I chose what came next. At this age, you understand that life doesn't give you clean endings. It gives you chapters you learn to live with. Scars that don't vanish, but stop aching when the weather changes. Memories that no longer control you, even if they still visit. If there's one thing I wish I'd known back then, it's this: generosity without boundaries is not love. It's self-erasure. And love that asks you to shrink so someone else can feel whole will always cost more than it gives. I don't regret paying for that wedding. I regret ignoring the quiet voice inside me that knew something wasn't right and asked me, softly, to pay attention. But regret, too, has its place. It teaches. It humbles. It reminds you that wisdom is earned, not inherited. So if you're listening to this now, maybe washing dishes, maybe driving home, maybe sitting alone the way I am, I want you to hear me clearly. You are allowed to step back. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to choose yourself without becoming hard. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is walk away with dignity and let life show you what you deserve next. I've told you my story. I've carried it for decades, and now I've set it down gently between us. Before we part, let me leave you with this. If you could sit across from your younger self right now, not to warn her, not to scare her, but simply to speak gently, what would you tell her about love? About loyalty? About the cost of always being the strong one? Would you tell her to listen more closely to that quiet discomfort she keeps explaining away? Would you tell her that being kind doesn't mean being expendable? Would you tell her that choosing herself won't make her selfish? It will make her whole? If this story touched something tender in you, stay here with me. Subscribe, not just for stories like mine, but for the reminders we all need as we grow. And if you feel brave enough, share one sentence in the comments, something you wish you had known sooner. If you were me, would you have made the same choice?